When the summer ends, will American students be forced back into the government schooling system? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we examine the idea of government schooling itself. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and former Ludwig von Mises professor at Hillsdale College. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Good to see you too in these times of blissful happiness and freedom and calmness, and which none of us have a problem in our lives. I mean, it's just wonderful.
Yeah, one of the funny things about this whole crisis is that they've always accused us libertarians of being, solitary people, of advocating the solitary life. That's what they're advocating now. Everybody stay alone and stay away from others.
They have commanded us into the atomistic society of which they always are accusing capitalism. What do they want us to do? Stay in your house and don't ever go near anybody. Well, that makes me an isolated atom.
Exactly. And when libertarians and others are out there protesting, saying, we want to hang out together with other people. No, we demand that you stay alone.
Oh my God. The Friends of Freedom believe in socializing. Their own version of socialism.
Right. Okay, and welcome to our viewers back for another week. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Come to visit us at fff.org. Richard, one of the interesting aspects of this whole thing is the public schooling system, and to a certain extent also the college university system, because you've got them closing the schools where the students were just ordered to return home. And maybe engage in some online type of thing, or maybe do some homeschooling, but they closed the public schools and essentially also on the college level sent children home, or students home. So the question is now, what's going to happen in the fall? Do they use compulsory attendance laws to force parents to send their kids back into these government institutions? And so I thought, well, this would be a good time for you and me to discuss the whole concept of public, or what we call government schooling, the concept of mandatory attendance laws, school taxes that fund this thing, the central bureaucracy that runs these things. And then also maybe even visit the university level as well, because your former college, Hillsdale College, certainly took and does take a very different view of higher education than other colleges and universities. So let me start out by just talking about the educational model. We have here at FFF, as you know, for 30 years, have said that this is a very bad system we have here of government schooling. And that's what it is. It's the government providing schooling for people. I sometimes call it Army Light. It's essentially based on the Army model. You've got compulsory attendance laws, like a draft, a military draft, that essentially forces parents to send their kids into this government school system. Now, we know, there are some alternatives, private schools, but as a realistic matter, that's not a viable alternative for many people. They're too expensive. There's homeschooling, but back in the 50s, as you know, homeschooling was illegal. It was just because of pressure put on by parents to get their kids out of this bad system that finally the states acceded to those demands. But a lot of parents are not competent to homeschool, or not interested in homeschooling. And so their only alternative is private schools, which they can't afford, or the public school system, which essentially becomes kind of a daycare center where they can park their kids while they go to work. And so you've got the school taxes, mandatory funding. I mean, there's nothing voluntary about taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, they will come and take away your property. And if you resist, they will kill you. And the best example of that was this guy, John Singer, back in Utah, back in the 50s that he refused to send his kids to school, and they came after him and they killed him. They called it resisting arrest, but they shot him dead because he refused to go along with this system. It's a socialist system. It's based on the concept of central planning, where you've got a central board of commissars, either at the federal level, Department of Education, or the state level, State Department of Education, the local level, the local school board, which is a government body. It's elected politicians, bureaucrats that plan the curriculum, decide the textbooks. It's a top-down command and control fashion that is based on the Army. It's that model. And so we see the consequences of this. I mean, kids, by the time they graduate from high school, they hate learning. They hate reading. As compared to every kid when he's 0 to 6 has this awe of the universe. He's badgering his parents with why, and he's absorbing everything. They smash all that out of him with the regimentation and indoctrination and memorization and cramming that goes into the government school system. A lot of people never recover from this ordeal. I figured that everybody was born for a particular purpose, and public schooling diverts people away from what that purpose is, and some people never discover it. And then you've got the indoctrination where people are convinced that they live in a free society. I mean, that was the big thing about libertarianism that I learned, that I'd been lied to. I don't live in a free society. It's just a big lie, this massive warfare state. But that's the product of the indoctrination, and sometimes it lasts a lifetime. I remember when I discovered libertarianism, all the scales were dropping from my eyes. My gosh, I've been lied to all these years in public schools about, doing the Pledge of Allegiance, limit in a republic with liberty and justice for all. It was just a lie. So it's extremely damaging what it does, especially kids in the inner city. It's horrible, this system. So what's the solution to this? Well, many years ago, FFF published this fantastic book by Sheldon Richman called Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. Still available on Amazon. It's timeless, highly recommended, that makes the definitive case for getting out of this educational morass. Separate school and state entirely, the way our ancestors separated church and state. No more school taxes, no more government school buildings, no more government curriculum, government school teachers. A total free market in education where parents are deciding the educational decisions of all their children, of each of which is different from the other, and where educational entrepreneurs are flooding the market with different options, different vehicles, different opportunities for people, including maybe workplace schools where people go to work and they take their kids with them to work. And there's a really nice school there that employers have put together. So you don't have to worry about licensing. Do the teachers have licenses and so forth? They just get out and hire competent people. So that's the paradigm. That's the solution to this educational morass. Total separation of school and state. What do you think?
Well, I think we should also remember the context in which public schooling came to the United States. For the most part, in the 19th century, or at least certainly for the first half of the 19th century, it began to change in the second half. Most education was extremely local, voluntary, and private. Church schools, for-profit schools, secular, charitable endeavors, both here and in Great Britain. For example, the now unfortunately deceased, but well-known economic historian Edwin G. West wrote a book called Education and the State a good number of years ago. But he pointed out that in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, before compulsory education in Great Britain, the private sector, against church and secular and for-profit, educated 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire British population between 1790 and 1830. And that's when people work in much longer hours in the factories or in the rural areas. But that's what the private sector did. The development of compulsory education, particularly in the middle and then the latter part of the 19th century, first the case and then the implementation of it in a growing number of states here in the United States, came from the Prussian model. Murray Rothbard has a very excellent essay on this called Education Free and Compulsory, which he wrote obviously many decades ago. But he pointed out, and others have as well, that the Prussian government in the 18th century and then in the 19th century wanted to indoctrinate their subjects. The King of Prussia, the kings of Prussia, wanted to indoctrinate their subjects to be loyal, obedient servants, to serve as taxpayers, and if necessary, to die as warriors in the Prussian state's military. Now, this had a particular appeal for some in the United States from a different setting, and that was we have these waves of immigrants, and how are we going to make sure that they're good Americans, loyal citizens? So what we need to do is we need to bring all of these waves of immigrants and native-born young people and put them in these systems of mandatory schools where they will learn the same curriculum, the same American history, the same values, the same belief systems. And it was basically meant to be an indoctrination avenue. Now, and that has remained what public education at one level has been all about. Now, the content has changed. For example, from when I was a small boy and going to grammar school and thinking of, let's say, a history class, I was told that Christopher Columbus was this great explorer who had found the New World, which led to the establishment of America, and it opened these opportunities, and industry came, and in the history textbooks you see proudly factories with belching smoke from the chimney stacks, and the mechanized equipment, cultivating the land, and cities growing out of the wilderness, urban areas, civilization, progress. And this was the way that everyone was taught to think about the founding of the discovery of the Americas and the founding and the development of the United States. Now, the content of the indoctrination has changed, but it's still indoctrination. Now what is it? Oh, Christopher Columbus was a bad man. That's all in the textbooks now. He wanted to plunder and kill the Native Americans, and they brought these diseases, and then by opening this pristine, wonderful, primitive land where man was one in tune with nature, Western corrupt civilization came, and the earth was filled with belching, polluting smoke. And now you're supposed to hate all of that. Now, I don't want to get into the issue of, pollution and environmental problems. That's not the issue. It's the idea that you take the generations of young people and you put them through an ideological sieve of what is meant to be a cookie-cut good citizen, of what is all believed in, based upon what is all taught, and the values you're supposed to share. When I was a child, we took a pledge of allegiance to this republic for which it stands. Freedom, the individual, opportunity, enterprise. Now, capitalism oppresses people of color and socially weaker and exploited groups. Again, that's separate from that ideological debate of these interpretations of capitalism versus a more socialist system. The issue is the idea it's meant to be an indoctrination system. For 12 years, they take your kids and they try to brainwash them. Now, I'll mention one other thing that has made the current system worse than in the past. In the 19th century and in the good part of the 20th century, they might have been trying to brainwash these kids, but the kid came out knowing penmanship and how to write and to do arithmetic and to be able to write an essay after reading, a short story or a novel by some famous author. There was a degree of literacy, but that was because those things were believed in. Now they get the indoctrination and they come out as cultural and arithmetical illiterates. I was just reading a piece this morning, Walter Williams' regular column. Walter Williams is a famous free market economist. He teaches at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, about the failure of government-mandated schools, not just in general, but for African American students, black students, how the tests have shown that they come out of high school and barely 10 or 15% of them have the minimum passing standards for doing basic arithmetic or to read. So not only is it an indoctrination system, but you no longer even have at least the side effect of making people being able to read something and to add columns of numbers. They don't even have that anymore. It's just indoctrination, because this is all that's important. Now, given that it's bad education and it's just an ideological factory, what then should we want? Well, as you were alluding to, what we want is a system where the state is removed from education. Some people would argue, but we're so poor. Not everybody can afford education. Even if you wanted to take that argument seriously back then, the poor person in America is middle class wealthy by the standards of multitudes of tens of millions around the world. And if you set the market free, just as the market provides better tasting toothpaste, new and improved flat screen, high pixel definition televisions, wrinkle-free shirts that more easily get out stains, you would find that if you freed education, denationalized it, depoliticized it, put it in the private sector where individual initiative, competition was put at work to attract students, to earn the revenue that would be the basis of the profits that a school could earn. You would see improvements in teaching methods. You would see a pedagogy. You'd see improvements in the nature and the content of the curriculum, and there'd be competitions in them. And you would depoliticize all of the schools. How so? You wouldn't have fights in local school boards. Shall we have evolution taught, or shall we have creationism taught? And it's a battle, because if one group gains a majority on the local school board, then everybody's kid is forced to have that which they may or may not want. Real diversity, where you have different contents of curriculum reflecting the values, beliefs, the needed knowledge that parents think their children should have, and that competitive drive would not only improve the excellence of the content and the form, but would keep the prices down. Because how do you attract more students, to fill more seats, to have bigger revenues over your expenses? By demonstrating to parents and their children that your house of learning is the place where they should want them to go. If we free up the system in this way, we do away with the illiteracy of our society, in my humble opinion, and the studies of private schools, or even, to be honest, the charter schools and whatever. Everything is better if you just let people have a degree of freedom. What we're calling for is just let the whole thing be free and take advantage of all that freedom can give. But even a little minimum amount of freedom shows that excellence can be given to what students are learning. Just free the system, get the shackles off. And if we do that, we will have a generation of illiterate young people filled with exciting ideas, taught in ways that keep their attention, and in cost structures that every family in America could find a niche to afford and still have the education, basically what they would want for their child. And one more thing, if I can just add an addendum to this. But what about the families who may not be able to afford this? They can't meet that tuition requirement. That's the basis of philanthropy and charity. I have taught at private universities, and I'm teaching at an institution now that is nominally, I say nominally because it basically is financially self-supporting, but nominally is a state institution, the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. Where does a huge bulk of money come from for those students who, on their own family circumstances, can't afford to go to college? Scholarships, grants, tuition support from the private sector, even with the taxes we're burdened with, even with the mindsets of supposedly wanting and needing and should having government finance these things, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people go to school every year, certainly at the college level and in private schools, as to the extent they exist, below that, through the charitable and philanthropic giving of many in the society. Think of a free society, a prosperous society, a growing society in which more people could afford to pay the competitive educations for their children. And for those who could not or not fully, the prosperity would be there for other Americans to generously be even more supporting in these ways than they already are.
Yeah, you make a good point. There's several good points. The dynamism of the market and the poor, and they go together. I mean, we know that the free market always produces the best of everything. I mean, we see that in automobiles and housing and so forth. You compare a government public housing project to a private condo. I mean, it's night and day. And so in a free market, you would have entrepreneurs catering to people in the lower echelons of the economic ladder. I mean, we see it today. Okay, wealthy people get nicer things. They drive Lexuses, and they have private airplanes, and they get the things first that are nice, like, a color television. But it's because they're able to afford those things that then those things become commonplace, so that we now all have color televisions and we all have computers and laptops. Well, it's the first that's the rich that are buying these things first that then provide the incentive for people to mass produce them. It's the same thing would happen in education. Yeah, the wealthy people would be able to go to the Harvards and the Princetons and so forth. I mean, but at the lower levels, you have an entire degree of restaurants that cater to poorer people or middle class people, where the food's great. It may not be as good as the $75 steak places, but it's very good. And then through that competitive process, the standard is raising for everybody. So that if you can conquer this sense of envy and covetousness, you see that everybody in society is rising economically, even though there's tremendously wealthy people. The people at the bottom are still better off than they would be if everybody was equal, because they've got a higher standard of living than they would be if you equalized everybody. Like in Cuba, where everybody's equal, but everybody's poor. Well, the same thing would happen in education. You'd have this rising standard in education. Part of the big problem, I think, in this, Richard, is that we grow up with this system. We're born in this system, and we think it's inevitable, that we just can't imagine life without public schooling. I mean, kids would go uneducated. I mean, everybody would be stupid in society. Nobody would know how to read. And, well, imagine if we had grown up in a public churching system where the state ran churches, and there was private churches too, but there was a competitive thing, and people were forced to go to church and take their kids to church. And we'd lived under that system for, 200 some odd years. And then along come you and me and other libertarians saying, this thing is a mess. I mean, people, they hate going to church. There's corruption. It's horrific. Let's just separate school, church and state. Get the state out of religion. Well, you can imagine the shock. Oh my gosh, you libertarians are so radical. Are you kidding me? You're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Nobody will go to church anymore if we don't force them to. We'll grow up as an immoral society. Well, that's because they grow up in this system. And so what people really have to do is think outside the box when we're analyzing this thing, instead of inside the box and how to run the public school more efficiently, how to get school vouchers to make the school system work better, or charter schools to make the school system work better. Break out of the box and think in terms of a free market educational system, like a free market church system. The poor don't have any problem finding churches to go to. They pretty much find any church they want to. The wealthy build the churches. They don't have qualifications there. They don't check at the door to see if you donated to the church or how much money you have or whether you're willing to donate to a church. I don't know any church that does that. Well, as you point out, in the educational arena, it's the same thing. There's people who are willing to help out people in need. They build churches especially when there's no more income tax, no more property taxes, no more school taxes. People can keep everything they earn. Well, now they have the incentive to do good with it. We've talked about the 1800s where there was no income tax and no IRS and everything was voluntary, charity, no Social Security, no Medicare. This is how the universities got built, the libraries got built, museums, wealthier people willing to help out. And that's what we need to restore in this country, a faith both in freedom and free markets, as well as a faith in the power of private charity.
Yes, you see, this is a major problem that we have with the current schooling system. I made that stark contrast, how is Christopher Columbus seen, as a hero or as a villain? But the point is that we have to remember that this is an indoctrination factory. There are these handful of state-approved textbooks that dominate the grammar and high school arena. And they all share a consensus view. Well, Franklin Roosevelt, he did save America. What would we do without Social Security or labor unions supported and subsidized through special dispensations by the government to do things that normally other people in the private sector would not be allowed to do, or minimum wage laws, or government housing, or public works, or. And because this is narrowly confined in the context of the consensus that these state boards of education decide upon which textbooks to adopt, and you want to have it to the lowest common denominator of a consensus ideology, so that your textbooks will sell in Texas and California and New York, and because these are huge markets. And that just undermines the diversity of ideas that would naturally bubble forth in a competitive arena. Now, one other thing perhaps we should add, and let me say a few words about this. Yeah, but how would we get from here to there? Well, obviously, you have to change a lot of people's minds, though I personally think that there has been a change in people's thinking over the decades. 50 or 60 years ago, if you said something about homeschooling, people would roll their eyes and think you're some type of a nut. Well, homeschooling is still a minority position, but it is more pervasive and it is more respectable than it was half a century ago, because people have not wanted their children to go through this meat grinder of state schooling. But so how would you privatize these things? Well, it's very simple. First of all, you could say, we're dismantling a state school system. Hand it over to the workers. That is, the employees and the teachers and the administrators of school X right here. Here, we're turning over ownership. You're now the joint shareholders of the school. Or you could put them up at public auction and to sell them either to standalone private companies that would want to have them, like a mom and pop store compared to the chain stores. Or there could be national or regional chains of these that want to offer schools, like insurance companies do, like fast food places do, like supermarkets do, like department stores do. You have chains of them through franchises. That could be done as well, which would have establishment of standards and requirements and brand name reputations by privatizing it in that way. And you could do a variety of these ways of doing it. Handing it over to the current employees in the school. They're now the shareholders of this private school, or selling them in these various ways. It doesn't have to be one size fits all to decide how you want to privatize. But the point is, get it out of government hands. And is everything going to change and become sweetness and light in 24 hours? Of course not. But I would suggest that with everything else, that once you turn things over to the creative and innovative and self-interested motives of people in the society in an arrangement of freedom, like planting a seed, it will grow, it will blossom, and we will have educational excellence that starts being available to harvest.
Yeah, your point about indoctrination is really interesting because, many years ago, I traveled to Cuba and I got a license from from the Treasury Department to go there. And then I got a special journalist visa from the Cuban interest section in Washington. And it was so interesting because one day I walked into the CIA museum in Havana, and there was a group of kids there on a field trip with their teacher. And the museum was all the things that the CIA had done to Cuba. You know, state-sponsored assassinations, trying to assassinate Castro and other officials, and terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. They blew up buildings there and so forth, and they had they killed innocent people. The invasion at the Bay of Pigs, and I'm thinking, wow, you know, this. I mean, public schooling is a socialist system. I mean, it's found in every socialist country. And I'm thinking, back in the United States, they are indoctrinating people in the exact opposite direction. The CIA is a great organization. It's for freedom. Cuba posed a grave threat to the United States. It was a dagger at our neck. We had no choice but to try to assassinate their people and so forth. And it's the same principle, that the government has no business indoctrinating anybody. That's not the role of government. That in a free market educational system, you pick your school or your educational device. If you want to do online education, if you want to go to a music school because you want your kid there because your kid just wants to play the guitar all day long, you make that call. You want a religious school, you've got that option. You want a secular school, you've got that option. You want, you know, a diverse school. I mean, that's the dynamism of the free market, that each of your kids is different. I mean, I think parents know that. And so instead of this cookie cutter mold for every kid, the dynamism of the market, entrepreneurs with flooding the market with all these educational opportunities, then parents can pick and choose, and then they can switch back and forth.
Yes, the answer to all of this is to put control back into the hands of the people themselves. You know, you had alluded, if people had always had mandatory, church, how would they react if you now said you don't have to go to church? It's a matter of free choice. What will happen to the morality of the country? Well, I mean, imagine that for the last 100 years, government had either directly or indirectly sought to the manufacture and the distribution of shoes for children. And then suddenly some strange weirdo like Jacob Hornberger comes along and says, what the hell is the government doing in the shoe business? Why shouldn't private enterprise be set free? Sell off the government shoe factories. Let the market determine the sizes and the varieties and the pricing and the selling of the shoes. Oh, you're a nut, Hornberger. How do you know that parents will be responsible enough to buy shoes for their kids? And they have to do it frequently because when they're small, the little feet are growing. You need a bigger shoe. Like parents could leave their kids barefoot or with holes in the soles with just a piece of cardboard, so their foot wouldn't be damaged. Oh, no, you're so heartless. We can't leave this up to the responsibility of people. They're too short-sighted to care for proper footwear for their children. Oh, you're so harsh, Hornberger. You must hate your fellow man. Obviously, I'm satirizing. I'm being rhetorical like this, but the principle, the logic is the same. People, when it's the system they're born into, find it very difficult to imagine an alternate arrangement of human association in which the foundation would be freedom and voluntarism compared to control and command and government dictating and guaranteeing. We just have to try to make our fellow citizens aware of this and to show why freedom works. And as in almost all other cases, government does not.
Yeah, let me just, before we wrap up, I know we're over time, but let me just touch on higher university level education, that we're so accustomed also to the government taxing people to get the money to subsidize higher education. And we totally oppose that too as libertarians. Why should anybody be forced to fund anything? Why shouldn't universities have to fund themselves, donations and tuition and so forth? And your college that you used to teach at, Hillsdale College, is a perfect example of that. That it has always been just totally funded voluntarily by donations and tuitions. And at one time, the government came in, the federal government, and said, well, we can control your students through the admission office because they're taking government grants. So Hillsdale said, well, we'll fix that. They prohibited any student from taking a government grant and raised the money immediately through voluntary donations so that they're totally independent from federal control. So it shows you that this could be the way across the educational spectrum.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. that could be the way that we could have educational excellence and opportunity and freedom of choice.
Yeah. All right. On that note, Richard, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for y'all tuning in. Thanks for your great support, especially during this crisis. And come and visit us at FFF.org. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And Richard, as always, enjoyed the conversation. And I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.